Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Purple Science Podcast. I'm Srishti, and as usual, I have another fun conversation with science for you. This episode is kind of special for me, and somebody pointed out that I keep saying this for every episode that I record. I really don't know how to explain this, but it is true, and maybe that is something I love about podcasting, that you get to sit with a complete stranger, get to listen to their journeys up close, how they fell in love with science, how they ended up where they are, what are the kind of challenges that they faced, and how did they manage to overcome them, and what creative stuff came out of these stories. It's just fascinating every little time I do it. Anyway, a few months ago I got to know about an amazing person, Dr. Sloka Iyengar, and that she is a neuroscientist and a Bharatnatyam dancer. Not that this is a very intriguing combination in itself, but she has managed to bring together the two of these passions and make something wonderful out of it. It is through her that I got to know about the concept of creative aging, and it really moved me. The conversation ahead is all about what the concept is, what is that she does, her journey so far, and this sweet little anecdotes from her life, and also just us sharing our love for science and dance together. Again, just a warm, lovely conversation with this amazing, amazing scientist and artist. I really can't wait for you all to listen to this. So let's pause here and get into the episode right away.
All right, Shloka, thank you so much for coming on the Purple Science podcast. Your journeys has been very, very interesting to me, and I was waiting for this moment to come. I really
Oh,
wanted
thank you.
all the details of it.
Thank you.
Your work is super, super exciting, and I am sure that people would love to know more about this.
Thank you for
Yeah.
having me.
Yeah, so before we even get into the science and dance part, if you can just tell us how you got into science and research in general, and maybe just some takeaways from your PhD journey.
Sure. So I think I was always interested in science. Like I was, I think like many or like most kids, like very curious, very active, wanted to do a lot of things. I will say my first love though was words. And I still remember, I grew up in Ahmedabad, and I remember my father used to get these, I don't know if they still have these Business India magazines. And I couldn't yet read. And I still remember, leafing through the pages and just like tracing words. So I feel like the fact that these, at that time, random shapes meant something was something very, very interesting. So I think at like a very instinctive level, I've always been interested in meaning, and what it is and how do we make meaning of the world around us. And really that love for words led to me writing for the Times of India as a child in
Wow.
Ahmedabad, and helping the editor of a children's section of Times of India called We Wonder. And the editor and I, we are still friends, and really I think my first love was science. And for the longest time, I wanted to be a journalist. I felt like, I wanted to be the person revealing the truth through words. And it was really this love of words. And over time, I started, of course, like I was always curious, always interested in science. And I still didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I did my undergrad in pharmacy. And, my mother was a big animal lover. So, of course, in India, I think still now, there are a lot of stray dogs. So, my mother was a big advocate for animal welfare. And she, even as a child, like, taught me first aid for birds, for hurt animals. And I had the fortune of working at an animal shelter called the Animal Help Foundation in Ahmedabad. So this was like right out of my college. Even through college, I was volunteering, but I got to work for an entire year while I was taking the GREs, kind of, trying to figure out what's next. And that opportunity as like, in my early 20s to be, it was a very public facing role. It just taught me a lot about people and about my city. I really love Ahmedabad. And we would have at any day on any day, I was in charge of the welfare of like 250 to 300 stray dogs. So we would capture or not capture, but like get them, perform surgery, and then one of my jobs was to release them back to the same environment or the same locality. Because of course, if you don't, then they'll have they're territorial, so they might fight with one another, and that may lead to more injuries. So it was really through animal behavior. I've always been fascinated by animals, but that time of working with them and just observing, and questioning, like what that tells, how does a dog know that it's hungry or thirsty? And looking at birds and, their very specific adaptations that make them who they are and make them successful in the wildlife, in wildlife. So through that was my love for research, and just that curiosity led to a more specific love for the brain. So that's a long story, but that's kind of how it worked out.
So beautiful. I mean, love for words. I think I've never heard something like that before. That is so
I still
profound.
love, yeah, I feel like that was my first, just something about it. And I mean, so much of science is writing. And I think
Yeah,
in a
true.
very, like it's about communication, it's about writing and the power that words have. I mean, every day I'm just awestruck at,
Hmm.
the words that we use make a difference.
Right. Yeah. I was just looking at some text, and the moment you said that, it's like, yeah, oh my God, these are literally just some characters that I'm making sense of.
Right.
Felt like magic. Wonderful. So, well, we'll again come back to science, but you have also been associated with Darpana Academy, which is another tangent of your life, and very interesting, in fact. There's some science connection to it, but as far as I know, I'd like to ask you, in fact, did this love for science originate in Darpana somehow, or if you had had any experiences that contributed to reconnecting with science, or any just fun anecdotes that you'd like to share with us from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I started dancing like many of us do, right? In India, or at least at that time did. Uh, I think I was 5. So,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the enormity or the importance of that place. Of course, as a child, you cannot grasp it, And I think your question of reconnecting is an interesting one, because I feel like maybe in the subconscious there was always there's like this uh aura of Vikram Sarabhai, in Cannot Miss. And of course, like dance, Bharatanatyam being so systematic, I think appealed at that time and still appeals to my very systematic mind, that there's a reason for why we do things. There's clarity, and really that like pedagogy where everything fits, I think. So in a way, maybe I didn't realize it when I was in Darpana, a couple of times a week, couple of days a week. But looking back, there probably was something to it. And especially now as a practicing, scientist and a practicing artist, there probably was something, but I think I was too young and maybe too oblivious to really articulate.
Yeah, but I mean, it's fantastic. As a dancer myself, I can totally, I think I've admired that place always. And it's so great that we have scientists still coming over there, and there are these stories coming out of Darbana even today, which is fantastic. Like,
Absolutely. And I think like a few memories, if I can tell, again, like, too young to really like understand
mhm.
the context, but the one thing, if you have been to Darpan, I mean, that place itself is like magnificent, right?
I
There's like
have
nothing
not.
like it. Oh my
Mm-hmm.
God. It is like really in the middle of Ahmedabad, and it's just like a jewel, and it overlooks Sabarmati. Um, but it was really like, in addition to Bharatanatyam, they were teaching puppets. So, the Kathputli, like the
Okay.
Rajasthani puppet. So that was
Interesting.
like,
Mm-hmm.
that whole branch of, yeah, like visual art. It was really like a very holistic place. There were people teaching drums. Of course, there were people teaching Kathakali. So I think the fact that it was just this like atmosphere where, you were able to just be exposed to so many things. And I also remember, like, I guess like a teenager, a young adult, they would bring, so like Amma would bring these artists to Ahmedabad. And, at that time, and now I haven't lived in Ahmedabad for a couple of years, but really world-class performers, pushing the edge of Bharatanatyam. So I think in a way, I feel there was always a sense that there's nothing you cannot do with this, because Amma and Didi were really bringing, and I was very like my teachers, of course, Mrinalini Sarabhi and Malika Sarabhi, Amma and Didi, they were the ones that, founded the organization. My directors, my gurus, I'm still working with them. And just watching, I think so much of what we do, more than science and dance, right, is like in science, it's reading other people's work. And in dance, it's again watching other people's work. And just the fact that what to even look for, in a performance, and just that subconscious immersion was, I mean, I cannot think of a better atmosphere to grow up in.
Yeah, so beautiful. It's lovely to hear. So, there's a lot more that I want to ask you about your career trajectory, because I was just reading about you, and there's so much that you have done, and you've transitioned from research to then health communications and then education. So maybe if you could give us a glimpse into how those career shifts happened, and your experiences in health communication and education, of course.
Yeah, so I did my PhD. My PhD was in neuroscience, and more specifically, it was in epilepsy. So, I came to the US in a way, like not knowing, I'd never even honestly taken any neuroscience courses. So it was scary to say the least. But I was my advisor, whose name is David Mott. I was his first graduate student. So, what was really interesting is back in Ahmedabad, I had set up or helped set up, the shelter. So, when we were in the middle of the city, we had a smaller space, but we really wanted to expand. So we were given a space that was kind of in the outskirts of Ahmedabad. So I helped, still have memories of building cages for our vultures and hawks. And, so there was a lot of like really like setting up to do. So I come to the US, and my advisor, David Mart, he was setting up his lab. So I think those skills and experiences of just kind of planning through things, trying things out that I did at the shelter, I was able to very interestingly do those things in the lab as well. So for 5 years, I studied with him. My project was looking at a process called synaptic plasticity, which is only a fancy word of talking about how the brain changes with experience. And my question was looking at synaptic plasticity in a part of the brain called the hippocampus, and looking at how seizures change synaptic plasticity. So I was doing a technique called electrophysiology, which is recording electrical activity from either single neurons or from circuits. So had really an amazing time. Like again, that total immersion in science, which is like I'd still love so much. I mean, just such a privilege to be able to be paid to think. I mean, what is better, right? Like somebody is paying you to think and write and do stuff that you already like to do. Um, and then so I'm in New York now. I came to New York after my PhD to do my postdoctoral fellowship. And again, that was also in epilepsy. And it was really, with 5 years of graduate work and close to 4 years of postdoctoral work, loved the science, loved thinking about problems, thinking of experiments, I realized that I really had never seen anyone have a seizure. So of course in India, at least when I was growing up, it was kind of not really talked about. So, for example, we had a neighbor who had seizures, who had epilepsy, but again, it was not something that was discussed. And I realized after so many years of working in the lab, I just had no experience of working with people that have seizures and epilepsy. And that kind of revelation, which had been bubbling for a while, it really kind of came to a head, and I decided to make a switch from basic science to clinical science. So I was working at an epileptologist's clinic and working with, children that have refractory epilepsies. Some of them, it was interesting from not seeing anyone with seizures. My first day at the clinic, saw a child with 20 seizures a day. And even again, going back to the words we use, like how do we talk to a parent of a child that has refractory epilepsy? And I think to your point about communication, I remember I was talking to, I think it was that mother. And, we just chatting, and she was asking me what I did before I got to the clinic. And I said, oh, I used to work with rats and mice and do this. And, her first response was, well, my son is not a rat. Right. And I think that was such a lesson that like as scientists, I mean, a personal lesson for me that like I need to be better and more conscious of the words we're using, the words I'm using. But as scientists, we have to do better at communicating to people that are afflicted,
Absolutely.
And I think that really that one sentence that, I probably didn't do a good enough job of telling her how my work in the lab probably could affect her child later on. But I think that knee-jerk reaction was very, very telling. So after that, I think I was there in that position for year and a half. Several things happened. I think it was very interesting being exposed to the patient population, which, I had not had that experience in that way. And it was like they ran out of funding, and it was a whole bunch of other things where, my interests also kind of started kind of evolving a little bit. So I went into science consulting, did that at, a couple of places for several years. So in that role, I was working. So the firm I was working for was hired by pharma companies. And that was kind of another step in, again, science communication, because the way we talk to patients is different from the way, Pfizer, for example, might talk to its people, or the way they advertise or publicize their things. So kind of learning that. And also, of course, when you're working for a pharma company, there's also a lot of like legal and ethical things that you kind of have to abide by. So learning those and kind of finding out the landscape of the work in which the science is placed was very, very interesting. So that brought me up to like 2020, and I had a big loss. I had several losses in my life where my husband and I, we lost his mother, we lost my mother. COVID happened, and there was just something about, um, again, nothing bad about like pharma companies. I think, whatever, like people are doing what they need to do. But I just felt that my skills could be better utilized in a different kind of setting. So I quit. Of course, like my mother was sick for a while, so I was already between India and New York. Then when she passed away, it was kind of again, like one of those, again, I wish she were around with us, and I wish she were here with us. But really losing her and losing my mother-in-law in such a, like, within literally 6 months, kind of changed a lot of things in just the way I view things. And that kind of realization that I probably have something to offer that is probably like not existent already, So and I know we'll talk a little bit more about it, but articulating the link between Bharatnatyam and neuroscience in a way that's scientific and in a way that really maintains the beauty of the form. I mean, there's a handful of people in the whole world doing it. And I just realized, or I guess, decided that, I have the privilege at this point to be okay with not having like one full-time job, and I can really explore what I want to do. So that's where we are now. That was a long story.
No, that was really interesting. I just had a follow-up question because you told us about the experience with the child and your experiences communicating with other patients even. So, as a science communicator, what do you think? What are your main concerns while you communicate, especially in health sciences? And I mean, starting from misinformation to like empathy, it could be anything. And because after COVID, it's a personal, I feel that there has been a lot of changes. So if you think so
Mm,
too, and what kind of changes did you face
yeah.
in people's awareness and the way they look at science?
Interesting. I mean, I that's a good question. I'm not sure of the change. I guess I was not paying, too close attention.
Mhm.
I will say, as part of my work at the Museum of Natural History, I
Yeah.
get to teach evolution. And, in India, I don't know how it is now, but we actually never learned evolution as a subject. That said, it was kind of implicit. We study
As a
science.
subject, as a separate subject, you're saying?
We didn't study, did you?
No, I mean, it was, of course, there was a small part of it, but
Yeah.
not so much. Yeah.
Yeah, so like, although I feel like we never studied evolution, like, I had actually never made a phylogenetic tree. I mean, I had never,
True.
like,
Yeah. Hmm.
and, there's, and I kind of like not embarrassed, but surprised to find that I learned those things as I was teaching. So I had
Mm.
never actually learned how to make a phylogenetic tree. Even if you think of what is a species, there's like multiple definitions of what is how do you define a species. So I think while evolution was never part of my curriculum, it was
Mhm.
implicit. So if you are studying biology, there's an implicit understanding that evolution is something that kind of like ties it all together. And I will say, I think before COVID, as I teach evolution to people, I teach evolution to educators. So these are people who will go on, who are already in classrooms, either high school, middle school, special ed, and they are teaching their students. So
Mhm.
the one thing that COVID has, I guess, the only thing that it has made better is just this realization of evolution, and I think with the
Yeah,
virus kind of mutating, and I think people were tracking that in real time. So I feel like I don't get that much pushback anymore.
I see.
I did get, yeah, so I think that's definitely been an interesting. I think people kind of understand at some level that it is, I don't think, I mean, it is not even that it's true, because what is true, right? I don't know. But I think there's like lesser pushback now as far as, like, why do I need to study evolution? Why does this matter, right? So I think
Yeah.
that is probably helped just from the news articles or just the things going out over the last several years. um as far as science communication in general, I mean, I should probably start about like what scientists can do better, and I think
Mm.
one is really the tone. I think many times the tone used is kind of condescending. And we have a lot of jargon, right? So like if you're a neuroscientist, there's jargon that we understand, and there is a reason for it. So, like we have certain words that we use so that we can communicate with other neuroscientists, but not everybody knows that. And that, I guess, can be said for any field, right? Like any field has its own jargon. You gotta understand it to some level to be able to understand what's happening. So I think from the perspective of the scientist, I think the tone we use is very important,
Yeah.
and a very we have to get better. And I think through podcasts like yours, there's other initiatives as well. I think there is that change happening where scientists are really going out in the community, going out in schools and talking about science. And it's like not a skill we ever learn. I mean, we never learn
Yeah.
5 years of my PhD, and you never learn how to talk to people who are not scientists.
Mhm.
And I think I was greatly helped because of my work at Times of India, because of my work at the shelter, because I love people, and I think that's another, I just love talking to people. I love hearing people's stories, what moves them, why they do what they do. So I think I am benefited by that, just like sheer interest in people and people's lives, and that exposure I had in India, where I was very, active and just like doing a lot of things and facilitated by my parents and teachers. So I think if I didn't have that, it would be very difficult. So I think going out in the community, talking about science in a way that again is not condescending, but is also not oversimplified. And I think that's
Right.
the balance, right?
Well,
Like I
yeah,
think
it's an art.
it's hard because science it's complex, right? So
Yeah.
like I think it's also inculcating a love for complexity, because
Mhm.
not everything in the world is simple, right? So if you're
True,
studying the
true.
brain, I mean, if it were simple, we would know everything about it, right? So embracing complexity, kind of going out in the community and really, talking about, okay, what we know about things, but also what we don't know. And of course, like you don't know everything, which is why there is a scientific enterprise, right? But I think a lot needs to be done from both from the scientists and from non-scientists to, and there's lots to be done, but thankfully there's things being done. So that's a good step.
I'm so glad that you brought this up. That scientists are never taught to talk to people.
No,
That's
no.
very very interesting. And recently I was talking to this one scientist who said that in fact we are the most introverted and isolated community that
Oh,
can be.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's so, I feel like now with my work in palliative care and just like being in the community, working with people, like it's just
Mhm.
amazing how if, and I think this is a good assumption to make, like if the goal of science is to relieve suffering, which I think it
Mhm.
should be, and I think it
Mhm.
is, we scientists are never taught about suffering. Like it's so
Yeah.
crazy to me, or just like
Mhm.
so paradoxical that we are not, taught about how to work with people. And
Very
granted, I
true.
feel like many scientists, their preference is to, and good for them, right? I think if you find out you want to be in the lab, and you want to write grants and you want to do that work, great, right? But I feel like many of us, we have other interests. And I know for myself, I would be very unhappy if I were in an academic role, because it just, would be very stifling for
Mhm.
me. Not to say that should be the case for anybody else, but yeah, we're never taught how to talk about our work to
True.
people that are not scientists.
Very true, very true. So I don't want us to diverge into something else, but I have a very quick question. It's like the reverse of what we were discussing. Do you think that science community? So some of us, we have been into science communication, and we don't have PhDs. We might not have research experiences, but we make really good bridges between the scientific community and the general public, and it's been working out well. But do you think that the core research experience that say a PhD gives, and I
Mhm.
don't mean the degree at all, just the
Mhm.
experience of dealing with one problem and trying to answer it, do you think that that helps people communicate their science better?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's, in addition to you have one problem, you're thinking about it, you're, looking at what other people have done. I think it is the complexity, because, and I don't, cannot talk about other scientific fields, although I assume it would be similar. I mean, everything in the brain is, nothing is simple, right? And I think I always go back to David, who my advisor would say, like, nothing, his deal was like, nothing worthwhile is ever easy, and I think when we
Yeah.
were, right, like, it's the brain. I mean, it is the most mysterious organ that we have. Like, it cannot be simple. So I think and again, it's not about the degree, but just the work of doing something, finding out, failing. Well, I think failure, again, is not something we talk about, right? It's like we look at papers, we look at what's been done, and As scientists, again, we don't talk about negative results. We don't talk about
Yeah.
failures.
Yeah.
But that's like,
True.
I would say it's like more than half of like life as a scientist. So I think it's more of the appreciation for complexity and how that kind of goes into how you communicate, you know? So, and again, I think there's a place for everybody to be able to communicate science. I don't think it should be only done by people that have PhDs or, you know, whatever degree. But I think it's
True.
that appreciation for complexity and how that plays out. And an example is, you know, like in my maybe it was not evolution, maybe it was another course, but we were talking about the subject matter was drugs of abuse, right? And it was something about, you know, and this is like the trajectory of how there's a paper, and then there's like a popular science article that comes out, and then there is another popular science article that has never bothered to look at the primary research, and that happens a lot, right?
Yeah.
So, which I think is not good practice. So in this particular case, and this was, you know, a student said something like, oh, I don't remember the exact thing, but, you know, dopamine receptors, that student was making a claim that, you know, addiction in chimpanzees or something like that is because of this one thing, and that tells us something about addiction in humans. And I was like, okay, that doesn't sound right, because nothing is that definite, right? Like to say that, I mean, then we would have solved the problem, right? So that itself is a kind of a red flag, that nothing is so simple and nothing is so direct. So you go to the paper, and I, you know, looked at the paper that student had cited, or the article which had cited another article, and clearly, like, you know, there was no, I doubt either of one of them had gone to the actual paper. You go to the paper, it's one figure in the paper, and they're talking about like one kind of dopamine receptor in one part of the brain, which is a very different thing from saying that dopamine causes this, right? I mean, first of all, we don't know causation, like that's another issue. But I think it's really that sense of complexity that comes with getting a PhD. And maybe there's other ways to do it. I don't know, but that would be my long answer to a short question.
Yeah, no, I think it is interesting. It'll be interesting to mention here that when how I got into psychom was I just realized that it is okay to say I don't know in science. And yeah, that was literally it. I realized this, and initially all the scientists, be it PhD students, we always talked in absolutes, which is so
True.
bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
The moment I started saying that, okay, I don't know, do we really know this? That facilitated a lot more conversation than thinking that science is the holy grail and is the ultimate truth. So,
Absolutely. And I think
yeah.
like if there's no questioning, right? I feel like I mean, that is the whole point of science. Like if you're
True.
not if you're not questioning, then like what's the point of anything? And I think it's you know, I feel like that can lead to kind of a defeatist attitude, but I don't think it should. I mean, I think that is the beauty of science, right? Like there is still so much around us we don't know. I mean, what is more amazing than that? Like what is right? Like we all have our little, like, you know, our brains in our bodies, but like we still don't know how our own brains work. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah,
what is
exactly.
more amazing, and what is a bigger privilege than being able to understand, even if it's like a tiny minuscule part of this problem, right? Like, I mean, what is more interesting? I don't, well, I'm biased, but
No. I completely agree to that, because yeah, who doesn't think that our own brains are interesting? Everybody thinks that.
True.
Yeah. Also, coming back to your experiences again, you were saying that you had a brief interaction with American Museum of Natural History, and that is very intriguing. Maybe if you have any takeaways from there, and especially for science communicators who are trying to work in that space, because the space is still growing in India. It's not as developed yet, but I think it's something that needs to be explored. So if you have any takeaways or any key experience that you think that people should listen to.
Yeah, so at my work at the museum, you know, I teach educators and I teach a bunch of courses. I think I mentioned evolution. I also teach neuroscience, I teach in a really cool course called the Diversity of Fishes.
So
Again, I
how
knew
does this
nothing.
work again? As
These
in
are,
teacher
yeah,
training
so
programs.
something like that. So these have always been online, and these are
I
like
see.
8 week long. Yeah, they're called seminars on sciences, and
Okay.
they have a whole bunch of courses. I mean, they have one on dinosaurs and birds. They have one on
Mhm.
spiders, like really amazing, very interesting
Interesting.
materials. And then there's essays and things that are from, like, for example, the dinosaurs course, or even my evolution course has, essays from like paleontologists at the museum.
Mhm.
Um, my job comes in when it is, so the students are expected to read the essays. Much of their kind of grading comes from their discussion. So we have, very broad discussion prompt. For evolution, it could be, why do you think evolution is the cornerstone of biology, right? It's like very broad. And students are expected to answer to that prompt. And then really, like, there's a lot of interaction between students. So they're also, sharing resources, teaching one another. And of course, since these are educators, there's also a component of how they can teach to their students.
Mm.
And my job comes in when I kind of like facilitate those conversations. Again, thinking of complexity. So if there's people are, I think a few things I've noticed, there's uh, the oversimplification, right? So
Mm-hmm.
my job would be to come in and say, like, well, let's look at the paper, and let's look at what the paper says, and kind of like going through, because again, like, reading a paper is a skill that, non-scientists, like, there's no way, or not no way, but it's hard to get that skill if you're not in the business of writing and reading papers every single day.
True, true.
So yeah, right, it would be like, kind of, let's go through this paper, let's understand what is happening. Also, many times it's, when you read a paper, like, they're, I think nowadays people do talk about limitations, right? So this is a limitation of this work, blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, like, the paper is meant for other scientists who already know the limitations of the techniques. Statistics is a big thing we talk about. So in my brain course, for example, fMRI is a big, like a big tool, and it's very exciting and all of that. But uh, what does that actually tell us? So if you see an image with like one part of the brain kind of, lit up, right? What does it actually mean? How did they get that image? How did they do the statistics, right? And I think, like, not that I'm a statistician, I think it's always an interesting, it may not tell us everything that we think it is, you know, if the n is really low or whatever it is, right? So like a lot of what I do is kind of going in, reading papers, um, really like facilitating discussions in a way that is diplomatic. So for example, one student a couple of years asked, why do I need to cite? I've been teaching for 20 years. I don't understand why I need to cite things when I'm
Mm-hmm.
writing. And I think that was like a big test of my diplomacy, where it's like, well, it's not, I mean, this is, as a scientist and as somebody who's in this business, right? Like, you gotta like look up other papers, you have to cite other papers. And the point is that other people need to be able to look at what you have done, go to the papers and find out for themselves, right? So I think the two things would be like diplomacy as a scientist, and really, again, choosing words, because the last thing I want to do is turn them off, right? Like, I want these 8 weeks for them to, if the only thing they get out with is that, this is an amazing thing and I want to learn more, like, I feel like I've done my job. And it's like, again, that diplomacy where, and I'm still being encouraging, but still kind of making sure that this is science after all, so you have to cite, you have to go to the primary source, you have to read. I think that is always that balance. I enjoy it because I think I'm always learning something new, and both in the science and also how to talk about it.
Sure. So basically, also, like, whenever I talk to people as a science communicator, I face this, that they always know more than I think, and I never want to assume that they
Mm-hmm.
know everything either. So how do you
True.
deal with that? I mean, what is a balanced way of communicating something, especially when it comes to something that is sensitive, like something related to health, or you
Yeah,
don't want
yeah.
to be too simplified, or you don't want to say something that will not help them at all. So how do you
I think,
maintain that
yeah, it's
balance?
It's hard. And I think, the one thing I would always, I mean, you know, taking the example of evolution, right? I think at least in the US, there's a lot of pushback from, and not to make like a sweeping statement, but
Mm-hmm.
from religious folks, for example. Oh, we didn't come from monkeys. We didn't come from, well, like I'm not a monkey, right? And I think the thing, is always to go to the science, right? So at least in that context, I can say that, I'm not a, what do you call it? What do you call a religious person? Like a priest, right?
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not a religious studies person. So like I do not know that aspect of things. But let's look at this paper, right? And like in context of this paper, what it is telling us, this is what we can tell. And I think the other thing I feel like helps is acknowledging the limitations of science, right? Or the limitations of the science now.
Mm.
And partly that is limitations of the technique. So, again, we're always learning, we're always pushing forward. And the paradox is that, some things might change, right? And we saw that with the pandemic, where it seemed as though people were changing recommendations every other day, but it was something that we were actually finding new information. So I think sticking to the science, also acknowledging the limitations of our understanding, right? Like we don't know everything there is to know. I mean,
Mm.
so
Yeah.
that is understanding in me. And limitations of the technique, and
Yeah.
the scientific method as we okay, I guess apply it, it is not, I mean, it's good and it has given us many many things, but it's still not eh, reflective, I think, of all of reality, right? So I think being, as scientists, being humble of that kind of truth.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, again, it's hard. It's hard. It's a
Mhm.
very good question. It's hard, but those are just a few things that have helped.
True, true. Yeah, that is completely true. So, I think at this point we can also come back to the interesting interface that you're working with, Bharatnatyam and neurology. We would love to know everything about that initiative. I think at this point, maybe if you can also tell us where you are based right now and what your current position is, and then maybe we can discuss everything about this interface, like its objectives, how did you come up with this idea, and how did you spark the connection between these two very different fields. So maybe a little
Yeah.
bit about your work right now, and then yeah, everything about the interface.
Yeah. So I'm based in New York now, and I've been here well, at this point, more than 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the idea, so I think I mentioned I've been learning dance, for a very long time. I had a break. So when I was doing my PhD and then 2 years of my postdoc, so a total of 7 years, I did not dance. And coming back to it was very, very interesting because, I remembered more than I thought I would. And another thing that had changed, or one thing that had changed was, at that point, coming back to it as a scientist. So I was, actually found myself as a practicing dancer and a practicing scientist, and really like reflecting on the points of convergences between, very specifically Bharatanatyam and neuroscience, but broadly arts and science, like any artistic discipline and any scientific discipline. And I had all these ideas, and again, coming back to my love of words, it was like, I remember it was like 2 years ago at this point, around like December, January, and I was like, I mean, I should write, I know how to write. I love to write. It never is a burden. Like I can, love it so much. I was like, let me just start writing down ideas that I have in a form of like short articles, and not knowing at that time if there was going to be an interest for it. And I was like, this is something I think deserves to be out, this kind of thinking. So I honestly just started writing on my website, and I, like little by little started posting on social media, kind of like I was always kind of aversive to social media a little bit, but kind of got over that, to some extent, and just started writing about, for example, one of the first things I talked about was movement and thinking about how the
Beautiful.
brain makes movement possible.
Mhm.
And of course, like Bharatanatyam has, as you know, like very small movements of our eyes, like very specific saccades, they're called. Two big movements that, traverse space. So again, thinking of movement as a way that, movement is life. You know what I mean? Like and we can also think of movement in our bodies, like movement inside our bodies. And really that connection, because dance is movement,
Yeah.
and that also like led to kind of like thinking about, I live in a part of Manhattan where we're close to the Hudson River. So there's a lot of like, well, there's some wildlife, but they're also like very specific to this part of the country. So again, coming to my love of animals, I just, started talking about, like a worm, like there was a rainstorm, I saw a worm, and thinking about, the very specific way worms move and what it is about their brains that make movement possible. So I think I get to just play, which is like a great place to be. So I get to write, play, talk to people, and really just like think of cool things to do.
Very nice. Also, right now, I think you are taking up initiatives, and I would love to know what kind of people do you work with, and what kind of, like, how can, if I, let's say I want to be involved in this, how can I do that?
Yes, I think like, that's an interesting question. So in addition to, or maybe not in addition, as like an outpost or, you know, um, of the work looking at Bharatanatyam and neuroscience, and, with my experiences with my mother and mother-in-law, like a big part of, or another part of what I do is using aspects of Bharatanatyam for creative aging.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm in senior centers, really like thinking of adaptive movement. And, it's another field. Again, these are not my discoveries, right? Like this dance form has been around for 2000 years, but it
Right.
is again coming to that, part of being that bridge between Bharatanatyam, which is, beautiful when it's done on stage. We do amazing things, and it's really a testament to our tradition that it has thrived over so many years. But it has so much to offer so many people, and I'm really thinking of the aspects of Bharatanatyam that can be used to support creative aging. And I think while it is not, there's no neuroscience, I guess, directly involved, it's still, it still affects the brain. And one, I think for people um, that want to get in, I mean, there's so much to do. I think there's just, I think it's a good and bad thing, where it's really a field where there's a lot that needs to be done. And I think one of the I shouldn't say it's easy because nothing is easy, but like writing about these things. And again, that is more intuitive to me, um,
Mm-hmm.
where we write about like, a big field is neuroaesthetics, and
Yeah.
looking at aesthetics of Bharatanatyam from a neuroscientific basis and talking about why is the brain drawn to certain kinds of movements, and I think we are benefited by these thousands of years of tradition and wisdom, right? So like we know that there's a reason, there's a science in our dance, like how amazing. And articulating it, I think, and then again, like I also want to be mindful of like the Western
Mm.
scientific tradition,
Mm.
where we talk about p-values, we talk about statistics. That said, I mean, we don't need a peer review to tell us that Bharatanatyam is amazing, right? Like we don't need
Yeah.
that, because we already know it, right? It's like in our history, in our culture, thousands of people have been doing it. So I think also being mindful of that. But that said, there are things that should be articulated, should be out for the entire world, I think, to notice. So I think it's probably my bias, but I think more conversations, right? Like more conversations between artists like Bharatanatyam dancers and scientists, people like myself, people like you doing both of these disciplines,
Mhm.
more conversations, and I guess more visibility, I would say.
True, true. So, two things. One is if you can elaborate on the term creative aging, what it is, and second thing is if you can give like specific examples of how exactly do you use this interface of Bharatnatyam,
Mm.
and how does it help creative aging? So, if we can,
Yeah,
talk more
sure,
about
sure.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So creative aging, I mean, just this idea that, as we age, and we're all aging, right? But I think at least in the US, we're thinking of people either 60 and older or 65 and older, and giving them avenues to be creative. And I think that's, through a whole bunch of modalities, whether it's visual art or poetry, or screenplay writing, really thinking of, creative avenues for older adults. I think that's, at its core. And with dance, of course, both Western forms of dance and Bharatanatyam, there is this, you have to look a certain way. You have to be, quote unquote, thin. You have to do, to be young. You have to be thin. And the fact that it's done on stage, right? That's like many times when we think of a dancer, we don't think of an 80-year-old woman, right? Like that's our socialization, our culture. That's worldwide, not
Well,
just, in
I
one
don't know
country.
about that,
So
but if you say dancer, I think I will imagine Mallika Sarafati.
true,
So,
true.
yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And I think like again, our at least Bharatanatyam, I don't know about our other, classical dance forms, is people, if you think of Western dance forms, like many times they are like they retire at 25. For us, that's when our time starts, right? So like again, that's another way in which I think we kind of respect older bodies and their
Mhm.
physicality.
Yeah.
So some of the things I'm doing are, like we have in Bharatanatyam a very systematized form of rhythm. And I think that's so that's again, not easy, but an intuitive way for people, many people that, I work with, they may be in wheelchairs, they may use walkers, they may be unsteady, they may be unsteady on their feet, they may have a fear of falling. um, One person with chronic back pain, she prefers to, kind of stay, not sleeping, but kind of like in that position on her couch. So, people of all abilities, there's arthritis, so really like thinking of what aspects of dance we can use. So when we think of rhythm very specifically, we can count it out, right? So that's one way where we like, that's a conventional way, I guess. Like when you go to a Carnatic music concert, right? People are counting the talam or the rhythm on their fingers. So I, would show that. There's also chant, not chant, but like words that go with it, right? So takketa, takkadhime. So people can count it with their fingers, they can say it, they can clap, they can, and so, like providing these options. And then
Yeah,
of course,
there's
if they can,
mathematics in it. Yes.
absolutely,
Just like
yeah. So
music.
yeah, so like teaching them, not teaching, but showing them, okay, like, this is the count and this is how it, and I think it's like there's so many avenues. It may not, counting may not appeal to everybody, but
Mhm.
clapping might, right? So like I
Yeah.
think our dance forms are just, I think, I mean, again, my bias, but perfect for this kind of avenue where you have people, with varying abilities, um, who want to do stuff, right? Like, and I think again, movement or what I saw with my mother and mother-in-law was how they were prevented from moving. And I thought that was a human rights violation. When we have older adults, instead of making sure that they can move in a safe way, we tell them that it's unsafe to move. And
Yeah.
then, they lose muscle tone. And of course, like, it becomes harder to move. They're afraid of falling. Instead of making it simpler, I just, that was like untenable to me that
Mhm.
was the case. And it could have been, again, like, not, we all, death is promised to all of us, right? I'm not saying that this is gonna like avert death or anything, but as an older adult, like they deserve to, they deserve to move. And it's like, it's our job, I think, to make it that they
Sure.
can. So rhythm is an example. I finished a series with an organization here called Arts for the Aging. And this, I worked with a poetry therapist. So she and we kind of like created a bunch of sessions where I wanted to bring in poets of Indian origin, but, we picked poems that were descriptive, that kind of lent themselves to movement. And we had like a very interesting couple of sessions on poetry and movement. So we used like a couple of Tagore's poems. Um,
Beautiful.
yeah, and there was one by Arun Kolatkar, I think, on a butterfly. It was so beautiful and just like so rich with descriptions, and I think those are the kinds of things that really lend themselves to dance, so poetry is another avenue. And of course, like we have hastas or mudras, and they are, again, being able to tell stories with our hands. I mean, and you don't have to move, right? Like you can sit. um yeah, so I think those are a few of the specific aspects I've used.
That's really fantastic. Have you tried this experiment in India as well? Or
Not yet, not yet. So of course,
Mhm.
like I haven't been to India in a while, and so far I've been doing it only in New York, but I think that's like another thing where, for the future, hopefully.
Yeah, sure.
But if any of your listeners,
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm really thinking with I mean, it's so great that you're doing this there, but there's in India, culturally, movement is not, it's something that not everybody does.
Mhm.
People are shy to, maybe dance. And so I'd really love to see how this works out in India.
I think that'll be amazing. I did a bunch of sessions at a place here called the India Home. So it's,
Mm,
I think when I work at a center, um, again, it's New York City, so it's people literally from all over the world. And
right.
the good thing about that is, like, I get to have a lot of fun. And, one of the things I do is, if there's, this word for, last week we were thinking of suffering, right? And I had a woman, she's from Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And, I asked her, what is the Russian word for suffering? And I think, like, being able to speak in your language in a foreign country, I mean, that's a matter of such pride, you know?
Yeah.
So when I have people that are not of Indian origin, I tend, or not tend, like I have to use themes that are universal. So the theme of suffering is universal. The
Mm-hmm.
theme of, liberation, I mean, those things are very universal, and everybody can hook on to those. At the India Home, where, there's people from Southeast Asia, I was able to kind of go more into our mythology and, go more into things that I probably wouldn't go with.
Interesting.
In But I think doing this in India, and like that would be so cool to,
Yeah.
to see how it works.
Yeah. I do think that there are like so many more reservations that people have about dancing and other performing arts. Of course,
True.
it's very rich. There's a whole community who still practices it in a very massive way. But there are reservations. So I would love for this to happen in India. I can't wait to
Oh
see it
my
happening
God.
here.
Maybe you or some of your listeners might
Yeah,
wanna,
sure.
partner.
Absolutely. So, as I was telling you, in the past few months, I've had this opportunity to see these two performances happening at the interface of science and dance, and of course, I also got to experience Malika Sarabhai's performance live, and there are some more initiatives that I've heard of. So, what do you think is the scope and potential of this interface worldwide and maybe in our country specifically as well? So, how do you envision this evolving in the coming years?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know much about the Indian setting. Uh,
Mhm.
I would say worldwide, I think there's a growing realization and a growing appreciation for this kind of what is known as interdisciplinary. I don't know if that's, I don't look at it. I think for me, they're the same discipline or very similar. So I don't know if they're interdisciplinary, but
Mhm.
I think looking at the problem from different points of view, right? Like I think um, I'm happy that I think it's slow, but I think it's steady. And I think that's an
Mhm.
amazing thing to see practitioners really thinking of, different ways of looking at things that may not be scientific or may be scientific, but may be also benefited from the arts. So I think it's like a growing movement for sure, both on like the side of describing. So I think, I think you were mentioning the genetics, right, of
Yeah.
people of India. Like that's a very scientific question. I did a similar one on caregiving and
Mhm.
how caregiving changes the brain, and what whether you're taking care of a child or a plant or a dog, or the act of taking care is profound. And we are who we are because someone took care of us, right? So I think thinking of these issues. I mean, science is great, and of course, I love science and the way of that way of thinking, but there has to be a humanistic component as well.
Yeah.
And for example, the caregiving example, I was able to, in Bharatnatyam, we have lullabies. So, actually describing and actually feeling what it is like to take care of somebody. I think this movement, I think, is steady and really excited to see, what comes out of it.
Yeah, true. But also, you use this for creative agent, which is very interesting. And the performances that I've been mentioning, that is, it's storytelling mostly. Do you
Mhm.
think that dance can be used as a medium to communicate science? And
Yeah.
would you think it is effective enough? I mean, it's of course different than, let's say, theater or filmmaking, but do you see it being used as a medium?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there is, and again, I don't know that much about Western dance forms, but I think one of the strengths of our dance forms, at least Bharatanatyam, is just how holistic it is, right? So there's definitely space, and I think I feel like what we have been given through our gurus and through their gurus is a vocabulary, right? So it's just like any
Yeah.
other language. And I think through that vocabulary, we can really, and the fact that this vocabulary is meant not to stifle, but to enable creativity, right? Like many
Yeah.
times we think, like, what more is there to do, right? Like how much, it's been around for 2000 years, right? Like how much more is there to do? Of course, as practitioners, you and I know that couldn't be farther from the truth, right?
True.
And I think being given this vocabulary is a gift. And I mean, science, absolutely. It may not be, when we think of the traditional modes of science communication, it's peer-reviewed papers, right? And
Mhm.
all that is, we can have debates about peer review and what that means. That's what we got now. But I mean, absolutely. I think the use of dance to communicate scientific themes, to communicate health-related themes, um, to communicate complexity, I
Yeah,
mean, again,
yeah.
it's so many points where I think it's a perfect
Have you tried it?
match. I have not, no, so I've done the caregiving part. So I was not talking about like the complexity of the brain, but more representing caregiving as um, through dance and science. Another thing I did last year, I believe, was partner with a scientist who studies songbirds. So
Oh.
he is interested in learning and he wants to know how we learn things. And songbirds are very interesting because, of course, they have to learn songs. This particular kind of bird he was looking at, he's looking at, um, they, the boy or the guy bird, like the male bird,
Mhm.
he learns this tune from his father. So the males sing, the female birds can vocalize, but they don't sing. But they have the song that they do is a mating song. So this song is like the most important song of this bird's life, because
Mhm.
that's what they made for life. How amazing, right? And
Yeah.
he is interested in error detection, and he wants to know how the brain detects errors. And he has this like cool experimental setup to understand how in this very, it's not even simplified. I mean, it's actually pretty complex, but maybe simpler than a human brain.
Yeah.
Um, so he and I partnered together, and while he was talking about, learning, error detection in learning, I kind of took it a step ahead and talked about error detection in the process of learning Bharatanatyam. So, and I made it more into like the lineage. So as a practitioner, you learn for many, many years. Implicit in that is that you know how to detect your own errors, and then kind of made it into a bigger story about like the lineage of dance and the lineage of science. So
Interesting.
maybe like the complexity, that could be an interesting thing to explore very specifically.
Beautiful. I think, as you said, this maybe this conversation is the beginning of something.
Yeah. Sure.
And yeah, I would personally love to explore and see people exploring dance as a medium to communicate science. That'll be amazing.
I think one of the things, like with anything that's new or different, right? Like there's people also need to pay for this, right? Like, and I think it's hard. Like, I mean, it's hard enough to make a living as an artist. It's hard enough to make a living as a scientist, right? Like
True.
there's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
historically, I mean, there's like very little money, and we don't do what we do because of the money, but you do want money to live, right? So I think even funding for these kinds of things, I think it's
Mm.
getting where, like, there's humanities, there are thing, mechanisms, granting mechanisms for interdisciplinary work. But I think we do need more of that as well to really, like, because otherwise it cannot be sustainable. And I feel like if we value this way of thinking about the world, there has to be funding for it.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree to that. I think that things are much better now, and I do see a lot of hope for this interface of science and arts. People are taking a lot of interest in it, and they're realizing the importance and, in fact, efficiency as well of this amalgamation.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I'm excited to see where this goes.
Likewise, no, it was great to, like, yeah, think about, the things that can be done, more things in India. That would be really, really cool.
Fantastic. Yeah. This also reminds me actually that we didn't discuss about this initiative called Dance Your PhD. Have you heard of
Oh,
it?
yeah. I have heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So because we were talking about communicating science through dance, and I think it's already been done through that initiative in some way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. No, I think it's a movement that needs, I'm hopeful, like very,
True,
very hopeful for its future.
true, very true. Yes, is there something else that we should
I
have
think,
talked
I
about?
think, no, I think I loved all your prompts, and I think you did a great job of being intentional about them, but also kind of allowing space. So thank you for doing this and for,
Thank you for
you know,
coming. Thank you for sparing time. I know that we have been wanting to do this for a very long time now, and I'm so glad that it's finally happened.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Anything else you need, just let me know. And I'm happy to, yeah, support in any way. Both to
Sure.
you and the I mean, not the readers, the listeners, if there's
Yes,
anything,
yes.
um, yeah, super exciting.
Awesome, awesome.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you for listening all the way up to here, and thank you for sending all the feedback my way. I really enjoy reading your kind comments. Please keep sending them because your suggestions is how I make more episodes and how I thrive this podcast. So please keep sending them. Thanks for tuning in to the Purple Science Podcast. We share stories every Tuesday. Our inbox is always open for your feedback, and our DMs across all social media platforms linked in the description are open to your unique stories. If you know somebody who might benefit from this, do share the podcast with them and spread the joy of learning.